They look like beggars, not soldiers. These exact words were spoken by an American major when he first saw the men who would change the history of warfare forever. July 1942. The Libyan desert, temperature over 50 degrees. A group of American officers in crisp uniforms steps out of a staff car and freezes in bewilderment. Before them sit ragged figures in Arab headscarves, with scorched faces, looking more like homeless vagabonds than elite fighters. And these vagabonds had just destroyed more German aircraft in 3 months than the entire Royal Air Force in North Africa. How is that even possible? Who were these mysterious warriors that the mighty American military machine was forced to learn from? What secret did they possess that allowed a handful of sunburnt desperados to bring the legendary Rommel to his knees? Today, I will tell you about an encounter that the official histories preferred to keep quiet about a night raid that made an American major forget everything he had been taught at West Point, about people who fought not by the rules but by results, and about why the most powerful army in the world had to admit that these beggars knew something that all the generals with their billions of dollars did not know. Stay until the end, because what happened on the night of July 27th, 1942, will turn your understanding of war completely upside down. July 1942, the Libyan desert, 53 degrees in the shade that simply does not exist here. A convoy of American officers in freshly pressed khaki uniforms climbs out of a staff Humber on the outskirts of Siwa Oasis, and the first thing they see is a group of ragged men in Arab keffiyehs with sun-scorched faces and Thompson submachine guns resting on their knees. These men sit directly on the sand around a soot-blackened kettle, and on their faces there is not a shadow of respect for the arriving allies. Major William Darby, future creator of the American Rangers, turns to his British escort and utters a phrase that will enter the history of special operations. They look like beggars, not soldiers. The British colonel from Middle East Command headquarters allows himself a thin smile and replies, "These beggars have destroyed more German aircraft in 3 months than our entire Royal Air Force in North Africa." This was not an exaggeration, not propaganda, not an attempt to impress the overseas guests. This was a cold statistical fact that would change the American understanding of warfare forever. But who were these people? How did a handful of sunburnt desperados in modified jeeps become the most effective strike force of the entire African campaign? And why did the mighty American military machine, with its billions of dollars and industrial power, have to learn from men who looked like desert vagabonds? The answer lies in one of the most remarkable military experiments of the 20th century, an experiment born of desperation, arrogance, and the pure British genius for improvisation. An experiment that began with one tall Scotsman who could not follow orders and ended with the creation of an entirely new form of warfare. But this was only the first act of a drama that would unfold across the burning sands of North Africa. The summer of 1942 was the darkest hour for British arms in the Middle East. Rommel's Afrika Korps had just captured Tobruk, taking 33,000 prisoners in a single day. Churchill called it a disgrace. The British Eighth Army was in full retreat toward Egypt. Cairo was burning classified documents, preparing for evacuation. Staff officers' wives were booking passage to South Africa. The Suez Canal, lifeline of the empire, seemed hours away from falling into German hands. In London, the Prime Minister faced a vote of no confidence in Parliament. In Washington, American generals openly questioned whether their new British allies were capable of fighting at all. The newspapers were filled with grim assessments. One American correspondent wrote that the British soldier was brave, but his commanders were incompetent, his equipment inferior, and his tactics belonged to the previous war. This judgment seemed harsh at the time. Within weeks, it would seem generous. Yet in this moment of supreme crisis, something extraordinary was happening in the deep desert. Far beyond the conventional front lines, far from the retreating columns and burning supply dumps, a small group of men was waging a completely different kind of war. They had no tanks, no artillery, no air support. They had a few dozen modified jeeps, some stolen German fuel, and an absolute contempt for the rules of conventional warfare. This was L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. The name itself was a lie, a deception operation designed to make the Germans believe that Britain had an entire brigade of paratroopers in the Middle East. In reality, there were never more than 65 men at any given time. But these 65 men would inflict more damage on Rommel's logistics than entire divisions of conventional forces, and they were about to have visitors from across the Atlantic. The American delegation that arrived at Siwa Oasis in July 1942 was not an ordinary diplomatic mission. These were the men who would build the United States Army Rangers, America's first elite commando unit of the modern era. They had come to learn. What they found defied everything they had been taught at West Point. Major William Orlando Darby was 31 years old, a career artillery officer from Arkansas who had never seen combat. He had been handpicked by General George Marshall himself to observe British commando operations and determine what lessons might apply to the American forces now streaming into the European theatre. Darby was skeptical. He had read the British Army manuals. He had studied their tactics. He was not impressed. The British Army, in his view, was a hidebound institution, trapped in the traditions of the previous century. His opinion was about to undergo a radical transformation. The first shock came before Darby even met the SAS operators. It came from the intelligence briefing delivered by a tired-looking major from Cairo headquarters. The major unrolled a map of the North African coast and began placing markers. Each marker represented a German or Italian airfield that had been attacked in the previous 3 months. There were 47 markers. The major then placed a second set of markers, these in blue, representing aircraft confirmed destroyed on the ground. The number was staggering: 372 aircraft eliminated without a single conventional battle. Darby interrupted to ask about casualties. The major checked his notes. Total British losses for these 47 operations: 11 men killed, 23 wounded, 3 captured. The Americans exchanged glances. This had to be a mistake, an error in the records, perhaps propaganda prepared for Allied consumption. It was not propaganda. It was mathematics of a kind that no military academy had ever taught. But the real education was about to begin. The man who emerged from a canvas tent to greet the American delegation looked nothing like a British officer. He was enormously tall, 6 feet 5 inches by most accounts, with a face that seemed to have been carved from the desert rock itself. He wore a filthy sheepskin coat despite the brutal heat, Arab sandals instead of army boots, and carried no visible rank insignia whatsoever. His beard had not seen a razor in weeks. His eyes, however, were the eyes of a predator, calm, calculating, utterly without fear. This was Lieutenant David Stirling, 26 years old, third son of a Scottish aristocratic family, former member of the Scots Guards and the Commandos, and the inventor of a new way of making war. He had no formal military training beyond basic officer courses. He had failed to summit Everest before the war due to poor eyesight. He had been considered a lazy, unfocused young man by his family, more interested in drinking and gambling than in serious pursuits. None of this mattered in the desert. Stirling greeted the Americans with the casual politeness of a man welcoming guests to a country house, not a military commander receiving Allied observers. He offered tea. He apologized for the lack of proper facilities. He did not apologize for his appearance or the appearance of his men. This, Darby would later note, was the first indication that something fundamentally different was happening here. The second indication came when Sterling began to explain his operational philosophy. Conventional military thinking in 1942 held that commando operations required elaborate planning, precise timing, and overwhelming force at the point of attack. The British commandos, whose raids on the French coast had captured the public imagination, typically deployed hundreds of men, supported by naval vessels and aircraft. They suffered heavy casualties. Their results were mixed. Their propaganda value exceeded their military impact. Sterling rejected every element of this approach. His theory was simple, almost insultingly so. Large forces attract attention. Attention brings response. Response means casualties. Therefore, use the smallest possible force. A handful of men in vehicles can cross the desert undetected. They can approach an enemy airfield at night, place explosive charges on parked aircraft, and disappear before dawn. No enemy can guard every airfield every night. Mathematics favors the attacker. Darby listened to this explanation with growing incredulity. It sounded like the fantasy of an amateur, not a serious military strategy. Where was the fire support? Where were the reinforcements? What happened when something went wrong? Sterling smiled at these questions. When something goes wrong, he explained, you adapt, you improvise, you trust your men to think for themselves. This is not an army. This is a hunting expedition. But it was not until Darby witnessed an actual operation that he understood what Sterling meant. The night of July 26, 1942, became a turning point in American military thinking. Major Darby and two of his officers were given permission to accompany an SAS patrol on a reconnaissance mission toward the German airfield at Fuka, roughly 250 miles behind enemy lines. What they witnessed would fundamentally reshape their concept of modern warfare. The patrol consisted of 5 modified jeeps and 18 men. The modifications themselves astonished the Americans. The standard Willys Jeep had been transformed into something between a weapons platform and a desert sailing vessel. The windscreens had been removed to prevent glare that might betray their position. Twin Vickers K machine guns, salvaged from crashed aircraft, had been mounted front and rear. Extra fuel cans lined the sides. The vehicles had been painted in desert camouflage patterns that seemed to blend perfectly with the surrounding terrain. But it was not the equipment that impressed Darby most. It was the men. The 18 operators represented a cross-section of the British class system that would have been impossible in any regular army unit. There was a Cambridge-educated classicist who spoke fluent Arabic and German. There was a former London dock worker with a criminal record for assault. There was an Anglo-Irish aristocrat who had represented Ireland in international rugby before the war. There was a Rhodesian farmer who could track a vehicle across solid rock. They addressed each other by first names regardless of rank. They made decisions by consensus. They moved through the desert with the easy confidence of men completely at home in their environment. The American officers, by contrast, felt like tourists in a hostile foreign land. The journey itself was an education in desert navigation. There were no roads, no landmarks, no signposts of any kind. The patrol navigator, a young lieutenant named Michael Sadler, guided the column using nothing but a sun compass during the day and the stars at night. He calculated distances by timing the speed of travel against known reference points. He compensated for the drift caused by soft sand. He did all of this while bouncing across terrain so rough that Darby feared his teeth would shatter. Sadler had learned these techniques from the long-range desert group, the reconnaissance unit that had pioneered deep desert operations before the SAS existed. He had spent months mastering the art of celestial navigation, studying the methods used by ancient Arab traders and adapting them for mechanized warfare. He could pinpoint his position anywhere in the western desert to within half a mile using nothing but a watch and the night sky. This was not something taught at West Point. This was not something any American officer had ever imagined possible. But the true revelation came on the night of July 27th. The patrol reached its observation position on a ridge overlooking the Fuka airfield at 2200 hours. Below them, illuminated by the soft glow of electric lights, lay a prize beyond calculation. 43 German aircraft sat in neat rows along the runway. Junkers Ju-88 bombers, Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, several larger transport aircraft, a fuel dump containing thousands of gallons of precious aviation gasoline, all of it virtually unguarded. Darby watched through binoculars as Sterling's men prepared for the attack. There was no dramatic briefing, no pep talk, no final prayer. The men simply checked their weapons, divided into 3 teams, and melted into the darkness. They moved with the silence of ghosts. One moment they were there, the next moment they had vanished completely. For 45 minutes, Darby and his officers waited in the darkness. They heard nothing. They saw nothing. The airfield below remained peaceful, the German guards strolling their posts with the bored routine of men who expected no trouble. Then, precisely at midnight, the silence ended. The first explosion tore through the fuselage of a Junkers bomber with a sound like thunder. Before the echo had faded, a second explosion ripped through the aircraft next to it. Then a third. Then a fourth. Within 90 seconds, 11 aircraft were burning fiercely, their fuel tanks adding orange fury to the desert night. The German guards ran in every direction, firing wildly at shadows. Searchlights swept the perimeter. Sirens wailed. But the attackers were already gone, slipping through gaps in the defenses they had identified during their approach. Not a single shot had been fired by the SAS. Not a single man had been seen by the enemy. And then something happened that Darby would describe for the rest of his life as the most audacious thing he had ever witnessed. Instead of retreating into the desert, 3 of the SAS jeeps roared directly onto the airfield itself. Their twin Vickers guns opened fire simultaneously, pouring armor-piercing rounds into the remaining aircraft at point-blank range. The tracers created streams of fire that seemed to connect the vehicles to their targets like burning umbilical cords. German soldiers scattered in panic. Some threw themselves flat. Others ran for bunkers that offered no protection against this mobile, unpredictable attack. The jeeps swept down the entire line of parked aircraft, guns blazing, then turned and made a second pass through the chaos they had created. More explosions, more burning fuel, more aircraft transformed into expensive scrap metal. The entire attack lasted less than 7 minutes. When it was over, 37 of the 43 aircraft on the field had been destroyed or rendered unflyable. Total SAS casualties, 1 man wounded in the arm by flying debris. Darby sat in stunned silence as the patrol reassembled at the rally point. His entire understanding of warfare had just been demolished as thoroughly as those German planes. Everything he had learned, everything he had been taught to believe about the relationship between force and effect, between risk and reward, between planning and execution, was wrong. The implications extended far beyond this single operation. The ride back to Siwa Oasis took 3 days. During this time, Darby conducted what amounted to an intensive course in unconventional warfare. He questioned every man in the patrol. He examined their equipment in detail. He studied their methods of navigation, communication, and resupply. He took copious notes in a leather-bound journal that would later become required reading at the Army Ranger training facility. What he learned contradicted nearly every principle of American military doctrine. The SAS operated without written orders. Sterling gave his men objectives, not instructions. How they achieved those objectives was left entirely to their own judgment. This violated the fundamental American belief in detailed operational planning and strict adherence to predetermined tactics. The SAS maintained no formal distinction between officers and enlisted men in the field. Decisions were made by whoever had the best information at the moment, regardless of rank. The patrol navigator, a lieutenant, routinely overruled his commanding officer on matters of route selection. The dock worker with the criminal record was considered the unit's foremost expert on explosives and was consulted accordingly. This violated the American principle of clear command hierarchy. The SAS recruited from the bottom up rather than the top down. Sterling had rejected more than 90% of the volunteers who applied to join his unit, including many highly decorated officers. He selected for adaptability, endurance, and psychological stability under stress rather than for conventional military achievements. He preferred men who could think to men who could obey. Most shocking of all, the SAS did not fight as a team in the traditional sense. Each man was trained to operate alone, if necessary, to complete the mission, even if every other member of the patrol was eliminated or captured. There were no heroic last stands, no holding positions to the last man. If the mission failed, you retreated. If you were cut off, you made your own way back to friendly lines. The unit's survival mattered more than any individual's glory. This was the antithesis of the American combat ethos. It was also devastatingly effective. But Darby's education was not yet complete. On the second day of the return journey, the patrol encountered a German reconnaissance column, 3 armored cars, and a motorcycle escort probing the desert approaches to Siwa. Standard military doctrine called for avoidance and evasion. The SAS jeeps were outgunned and outnumbered. Any engagement would risk the entire patrol for no strategic gain. Sterling ordered an immediate attack. The logic, he explained later, was counterintuitive but sound. If the German column was allowed to proceed, it would discover the SAS base at Siwa. This would compromise months of operational preparation. The column had to be destroyed completely, with no survivors to report what they had seen. The risk of engagement was therefore less than the risk of avoidance. What followed was a masterclass in desert ambush tactics. The SAS jeeps spread out in a wide crescent formation, concealing themselves behind a series of low dunes. The German column approached along a predictable route, following the firm ground of a dried wadi. They never saw the ambush until it was far too late. The first volley from the twin Vickers destroyed the lead armored car before its crew could traverse their turret. The second volley disabled the rear vehicle, trapping the column in a killing zone. The motorcycle escorts scattered, but they had nowhere to go. The desert offered no cover, no concealment, no escape. Within 4 minutes, the entire German force had been eliminated. 18 enemy soldiers lay scattered across the sand. Not a single SAS man had been scratched. Darby noted that none of Sterling's men celebrated their victory. They did not cheer or congratulate each other. They simply reloaded their weapons, checked their vehicles for damage, and resumed the journey home. This cold professionalism disturbed the American observers almost as much as the violence they had just witnessed. These were not warriors in any traditional sense. These were technicians of destruction, craftsmen of chaos, artists of annihilation, and they were changing the nature of war itself. The report that Major Darby submitted to General Marshall in August 1942 ran to 47 pages. It was classified secret and distributed to fewer than 20 officers in the entire United States Army. Its conclusions would shape American special operations doctrine for the next 8 decades. Darby's first recommendation was straightforward. The United States must create its own special operations capability immediately. The SAS model, he wrote, offers advantages of economy, flexibility, and effectiveness that cannot be matched by conventional forces. Every dollar invested in small unit raiding capabilities returns tenfold in enemy resources destroyed. His second recommendation was more controversial. Darby argued that special operations units must be separated from the regular Army command structure. The SAS succeeded, he observed, precisely because they operated outside normal military bureaucracy. They could recruit unconventional soldiers. They could modify their equipment without approval from distant headquarters. They could accept missions that conventional commanders considered too risky. This independence was not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature to be preserved. His third recommendation was the most radical of all. Darby proposed that special operations be elevated to equal status with conventional infantry, armor, and artillery. This was heresy in 1942. The American military establishment viewed commandos as auxiliary forces, useful for small-scale harassment but fundamentally inferior to mass formations of regular troops. Darby disagreed violently. The SAS have demonstrated, he wrote, that small forces operating independently can achieve strategic effects previously believed impossible. We ignore this lesson at our peril. Not everyone agreed with his assessment, but events in North Africa were about to provide irrefutable proof. The following months saw the SAS achieve results that defied all statistical probability. Between July and December 1942, L Detachment conducted over 100 operations behind German and Italian lines. They destroyed more than 400 aircraft on the ground. They demolished countless fuel and ammunition dumps. They cut supply lines, ambushed convoys, and generally made life miserable for the entire Axis logistical apparatus in North Africa. These numbers demand context to be fully appreciated. The Royal Air Force in North Africa flew thousands of sorties during the same period. They lost dozens of pilots in action. They expended millions of rounds of ammunition and thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. They achieved an average of approximately 70 confirmed aircraft eliminations in air-to-air combat. The SAS destroyed more than 5 times as many aircraft with a force of fewer than 100 men. Their total expenditure in ammunition was negligible. Their fuel consumption was trivial. Their losses, while painful, were sustainable. By any rational calculation of military effectiveness, the SAS represented the single greatest return on investment in the entire North African campaign. Rommel himself acknowledged the problem. In his war diary, the Desert Fox wrote that these British commandos were inflicting damage out of all proportion to their small numbers. He demanded more guards for his airfields, more patrols in the deep desert, more resources devoted to protecting his vulnerable rear areas. Every soldier assigned to guard duty was a soldier not available for the front lines. Every aircraft kept in protected revetments was an aircraft not bombing British positions. The SAS was forcing the Africa Corps to fight a two-front war, and they were winning both. But it was not only the British who learned from these operations. The American observers who visited the SAS in 1942 returned home with notebooks full of tactical innovations. Many of these innovations would be incorporated into the training program for the 1st Ranger Battalion, which Darby began forming in Northern Ireland in June of that year. Some would influence American military thinking for generations to come. The concept of the small, self-sufficient patrol operating deep behind enemy lines became central to American Special Operations doctrine. The Rangers, the Special Forces, the SEALs, and eventually the Delta Force all trace their lineage directly to the lessons learned in the Western Desert. The modern American military's obsession with precision strikes, surgical raids, and economy of force can be dated precisely to that July day in 1942 when William Darby watched a handful of beggars destroy an entire German air wing. But perhaps the most important lesson was the simplest one. War is not won by following rules. War is won by men who can think for themselves, adapt to circumstances, and accomplish their missions despite obstacles that would paralyze more conventional forces. The SAS succeeded because David Sterling refused to accept the limitations that his superiors imposed on him. He rejected the doctrine of his time. He invented a new doctrine based on observation, experimentation, and relentless pragmatism. This spirit of innovation would define Special Operations Forces ever since. The meeting between American Rangers and British SAS in the summer of 1942 was not merely a tactical exchange. It was a collision between two military cultures, two ways of thinking about war, two visions of what soldiers could achieve. The Americans arrived expecting to teach. They departed determined to learn. And the desert, that merciless crucible of sand and sun and silence, continued to forge warriors unlike any the world had seen before. Consider the sheer audacity of the SAS approach to warfare. In 1942, the British Empire was fighting for its survival. Conventional wisdom demanded concentration of force, mass formations, overwhelming firepower. Every military textbook written in the previous century emphasized the importance of numerical superiority at the point of decision. And here was a 26-year-old aristocrat arguing that all of this was wrong. Sterling's insight was that the industrial age had changed the mathematics of warfare in ways that conventional generals had not yet grasped. Modern armies depended on supply lines, communication networks, fuel depots, and airfields that stretched hundreds of miles behind the front lines. These support systems were incredibly vulnerable. Destroy an aircraft on the ground, and you destroy not only the machine, but the months of training invested in its pilot, the infrastructure required to maintain it, the logistics chain that delivered its fuel and ammunition. The cost-benefit ratio was absurd. A single SAS man with a rucksack full of explosives could destroy resources worth millions of pounds. A jeep patrol with 20 men could inflict damage that would take an entire division of infantry to achieve through conventional means. This was not guerrilla warfare in the traditional sense. This was industrial sabotage conducted by uniformed soldiers operating under the laws of war. The Germans never fully understood what was happening to them. Their response to the SAS threat was rational, but ultimately futile. They increased guard forces at airfields, which reduced the men available for combat operations. They dispersed their aircraft, which reduced operational efficiency. They mounted more patrols in the deep desert, which consumed fuel and wore out vehicles at an accelerated rate. Every countermeasure they took imposed costs far greater than the resources required to threaten them. This was the genius of asymmetric warfare, demonstrated decades before that term entered military vocabulary. The SAS did not need to destroy Rommel's army. They needed only to make his army expensive to operate. Every guard posted at an airfield was a rifleman not facing the 8th Army at El Alamein. Every patrol searching the desert for British raiders was a reconnaissance unit not gathering intelligence about Allied movements. The cumulative effect was devastating. But there was another dimension to the SAS achievement that the American observers found even more remarkable than their tactical success. It was the psychological transformation that service in the unit created. Men who joined the SAS as conventional soldiers emerged as something entirely different. They developed an almost supernatural confidence in their own abilities. They lost their fear of the dark, of the enemy, of the vast and hostile desert. They came to believe with complete conviction that no obstacle was insurmountable, no mission impossible, no enemy invincible. This was not bravado or foolish optimism. It was the product of rigorous training, repeated success, and the experience of operating in an environment where only competence determined survival. The desert stripped away all pretense, all excuses, all illusions. Either you could navigate by the stars, or you could not. Either you could maintain your vehicle in sand conditions, or you could not. Either you could keep your nerve under fire, or you could not. The SAS selection process was designed to identify men who could meet these demands and eliminate those who could not. More than 90% of volunteers failed. Those who succeeded found themselves part of an elite brotherhood, unlike anything else in the British military. Darby was particularly struck by the unit's approach to leadership. In the conventional American Army, officers commanded and enlisted, men obeyed. The relationship was hierarchical, formal, and clearly defined by regulations stretching back to the foundation of the Republic. In the SAS, these distinctions seemed almost meaningless. Officers and enlisted men slept in the same conditions, ate the same rations, faced the same risks. Decisions were made collaboratively, with input from whoever had relevant expertise, regardless of rank. A corporal who knew more about explosives than his captain was expected to speak up, and the captain was expected to listen. This was not democracy in any formal sense, but it was something far more radical than the American military had ever contemplated. The results spoke for themselves. SAS morale was extraordinary. Men who had been indifferent soldiers in conventional units became fanatics in Sterling's command. They volunteered for operations that any rational calculation would have rejected as suicidal. They accepted hardships that would have broken ordinary troops. They developed a pride in their unit that bordered on religious devotion. This was no accident. Sterling had deliberately designed his organization to maximize psychological commitment. By making every man responsible for the success or failure of operations, he gave every man a stake in the outcome. By treating every man as a valued expert rather than an interchangeable component, he created loyalty that no amount of discipline could have produced. The American Rangers would attempt to replicate this culture. They would succeed to a remarkable degree. But they never quite captured the particular madness that characterized the original SAS. That combination of aristocratic eccentricity and working-class toughness that could only have emerged from the British class system under the extreme pressures of total war. Some things cannot be exported. Some things can only be understood by witnessing them firsthand. The story of that July encounter between American observers and British raiders contains lessons that extend far beyond military history. It is a story about the limits of institutional thinking, the power of individual vision, and the extraordinary things that become possible when conventional assumptions are discarded. David Sterling was not a military genius in any conventional sense. He was not a great strategist like Rommel or a brilliant organizer like Eisenhower. He was something rarer and in some ways more valuable, a man who could see past the accumulated wisdom of his profession to the simple truths that lay beneath. His insight was that modern warfare had created vulnerabilities that modern doctrine had not yet learned to exploit. His achievement was to design an organization capable of exploiting those vulnerabilities with maximum efficiency and minimum cost. His legacy was a transformation in military thinking that continues to shape operations around the world 8 decades later. The American officers who witnessed the SAS in action understood immediately that they were seeing something new. They did not fully understand what they were seeing, could not have articulated the theoretical principles that Sterling had grasped intuitively. But they recognized effectiveness when they encountered it. They recognized that these beggars, these desert vagabonds, these sunburnt desperadoes in their modified jeeps had achieved something that all the armored divisions and air squadrons of the conventional forces had failed to achieve. They had made Rommel afraid. Not afraid for his personal safety, not afraid of a decisive defeat in battle, but afraid of the slow, steady erosion of his capabilities by an enemy he could neither find nor defeat. The Africa Corps was bleeding from 1,000 small wounds, and every wound weakened its ability to fight the decisive battles that would determine the fate of North Africa. This was the true achievement of the SAS in 1942. Not the aircraft destroyed, or the fuel dumps ignited, or the convoys ambushed, but the demonstration that a new form of warfare was possible. A form of warfare in which quality could defeat quantity, in which intelligence could overcome mass, in which a few determined men could change the course of history. The American observers returned home transformed. They carried with them not just tactical lessons, but a new vision of what military forces could accomplish. The 1st Ranger Battalion that William Darby formed in the following months bore the direct imprint of what he had learned in the Western Desert. The Rangers would fight in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, in France. They would suffer terribly at Cisterna and on Pointe du Hoc, but they would carry with them the spirit of that first meeting with the SAS, the understanding that audacity and skill could achieve what caution and mass could not. And the legend grew. The SAS themselves went on to even greater achievements. After North Africa, they operated in Sicily, Italy, and France. They jumped behind enemy lines on D-Day. They fought in the Vosges Mountains and the Rhine crossings. They took part in the liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Wherever there was a mission too dangerous for conventional forces, the SAS was called. But nothing quite matched the purity of those desert operations in 1942. In the vast emptiness of the Libyan sand sea, far from any reinforcement or support, David Stirling and his handful of volunteers had proven something fundamental about the nature of warfare. They had shown that the most powerful armies in the world could be defeated, not by matching their strength, but by circumventing it entirely. This was the lesson that Major William Darby carried back to America. This was the lesson that would shape special operations doctrine for generations. This was the lesson that began with a dismissive remark about beggars and ended with a revolution in military thinking. They looked like beggars, not soldiers, but these beggars had changed the world. The final irony of that July encounter was that neither the Americans nor the British fully grasped its significance at the time. The war had years yet to run. North Africa would eventually be won by conventional forces in conventional battles. Montgomery's victory at El Alamein would receive the headlines that the SAS raids never generated. Rommel would be defeated, then recalled to Germany, then forced to end his own life after the failed plot against Hitler. But the seed planted in the desert that summer would grow into something vast and enduring. Today, every major military force in the world maintains special operations capabilities modeled directly or indirectly on the SAS. The American Special Forces, the Navy SEALs, the Delta Force, the French Foreign Legion's airborne regiments, the German KSK, the Israeli Sayeret Matkal, and dozens of other elite units trace their intellectual lineage back to that small band of raiders in the Western Desert. The tactics they employ, the equipment they use, the selection processes they follow, all bear the unmistakable imprint of David Stirling's original vision. The man himself would have been amused by this outcome. Stirling never sought glory or recognition. He was captured by the Germans in January 1943 and spent the rest of the war in Colditz Castle, making repeated escape attempts that never quite succeeded. After the war, he lived quietly, involving himself in various business ventures and occasional controversies, never trading on his wartime reputation. He received no great honors, no statues, no public acclaim until long after the events that made him famous. The SAS ethos that he created, with its emphasis on results over recognition, ensured that he remained in the shadows where he had always operated most effectively. But his legacy endures in every special forces operation conducted around the world, in every raid that uses speed and surprise instead of overwhelming force, in every mission that depends on individual skill rather than mass firepower, in every unit that selects for adaptability rather than conformity. The Beggars have inherited the earth, and somewhere in the archives of the United States Army, in a file marked "Secret" and long since forgotten, lies a 47-page report written by a young artillery officer from Arkansas, a report that begins with a dismissive observation about desert vagabonds and ends with recommendations that changed the nature of modern warfare. Major William Darby wrote that report in the summer of 1942. He would not live to see its full impact. He fell in Italy in April 1945, leading his Rangers in one of the final actions of the European War. But his words lived on, shaping doctrine and training and thinking for generations of American soldiers who never knew his name. They look like beggars, not soldiers. Yes, they did. And that was precisely the point.